He left her without knowing she was pregnant. Years later, a little boy with his eyes begged for medicine, and everything unraveled. The morning had started like any other for Matthew Carter: meetings, phone calls, and a quick stop at the downtown medical research center where his company was finalizing a high-profile contract. He was used to walking into hospitals with the quiet confidence of someone who owned half the patents on the shelves. People moved aside when he entered. His schedule was packed to the minute, and his signature was worth millions. He had long ago accepted that his time wasn't really his anymore, it belonged to the empire he'd built. And he was fine with that. Or at least, he had been. Until today. As he stepped through the automatic doors of the clinic's reception area, his attention was caught by a sound that didn't quite belong. It wasn't a machine beeping or the rustle of lab coats, it was a child's voice. Desperate, trembling. Matthew slowed down, scanning the front desk where a boy, no older than 6, was standing on tiptoes, his small hands tightly gripping a pile of coins. He was speaking quickly, almost breathlessly, as if the words might slip away if he didn't get them out fast enough. "Please," the boy said, "my mom needs this medicine. I have money. I counted it twice." The nurse looked sympathetic but hesitant, glancing around for help. Matthew stood frozen for a second, something about the boy's face drawing him in. Blonde hair. Striking blue eyes. Pale cheeks and a stubborn little chin. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the child. He wasn't just any kid. He looked like someone. Someone Matthew had tried very hard not to think about for years. He walked over slowly, as if approaching a fragile object. The boy turned to him, clearly nervous but not afraid. Matthew crouched down to eye level, lowering his voice. "Hey there, what's your name?" The boy clutched his coins tighter, not answering right away. His eyes scanned Matthew's face, wary but curious. "Ben," he finally said. "Benjamin." Matthew's heart skipped. "And what's your mom's name?" The boy hesitated again, then said quietly, "Emily." "Emily Reeves." Matthew felt like the floor shifted under him. That name, he hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 7 years, not since the day he walked away from a woman he had loved more than he could admit. Back then, he told himself it was necessary. He had to focus. He had to climb higher. Emily had been gentle, creative, loyal, but she wanted things he didn't think he could give: family, stability, time. And so, he left her standing in the rain outside his apartment, no goodbye beyond a silent locked door. He swallowed hard. "And she's sick." Ben nodded, a little more confident now. "She doesn't get up much anymore. She needs her medicine. I came to get it for her, but I guess I didn't have enough." Matthew stood, quickly pulling his wallet from his coat. "Don't worry about the money," he told the nurse. "Put it on my account." The nurse hesitated, then nodded, and began filling the prescription. Matthew turned back to Ben. "Can I drive you home? I'd like to make sure your mom gets this safely." Ben looked at him, and there was a moment, a flicker of something unspoken. Then he nodded and reached for Matthew's hand. As they walked toward the exit, Matthew felt the weight of 7 years of silence press against his chest. If this was what it looked like, if this boy was really his, then everything was about to change. And somehow, he already knew it had. The ride to Ben's house was quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of traffic and the soft hum of the engine. Matthew kept glancing at the boy in the passenger seat, trying to piece together everything that was unraveling inside him. There were too many questions, each one piling on the last, making it hard to focus. How could Emily have kept this from him? Had she known where to find him all these years? Why hadn't she reached out? But beneath all of that, beneath the confusion and the shock, was something deeper. Guilt. Because he already knew the answer to most of those questions. He had walked away and made it clear that his life didn't have space for her, or anything that came with her. Ben sat still, his hands resting in his lap, his small frame tense. Matthew could tell he wasn't used to being in a car like this. The boy kept glancing around the sleek interior, wide-eyed, but too polite to ask questions. It made Matthew's chest tighten. This wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just a child in need of help. This was his son. He could feel it. In the way the boy tilted his head when he was thinking, the way his blue eyes narrowed slightly when concentrating, it was like watching a reflection of a younger version of himself. The neighborhood they entered was quiet and worn down. Houses with chipped paint, patched roofs, and chain-link fences lined the street. When Ben pointed to a small, one-story house at the end of the block, Matthew's heart sank further. The porch steps were uneven, and the front door hung slightly crooked. It wasn't unsafe, but it screamed struggle. Survival. Ben led the way inside without a word. The living room was tidy but sparse. Faded curtains, an old couch with a crocheted blanket, and a few scattered toys told the story of a life lived with care but without much comfort. And then he saw her. Emily was lying on the couch, partially propped up by a pillow. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her skin pale, and her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked exhausted. But her eyes, those deep brown eyes, still held the same fire, even through the obvious fatigue. When she saw Matthew standing in her living room, medicine bag in hand, she went perfectly still. It was as if time stopped. What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was at the clinic," he said, unsure of how to make this moment less surreal. "I saw Ben. He was trying to buy medicine for you." Her expression changed, and something like shame flickered in her eyes. She tried to sit up straighter but winced slightly. "You didn't have to bring him back," she said, guarded. "I did," Matthew replied. "He shouldn't have had to do that alone." Emily looked at her son, who stood quietly beside the couch. "Ben, sweetheart, thank you. Go wash your hands, okay?" Ben nodded and left the room. The sound of water running in the bathroom offered a brief moment of privacy between them. Matthew looked at her closely. "Is he mine?" She stared back at him, and in that instant, he could see all the years between them, all the words left unsaid. "Yes," she said finally. "He's yours." He sat down in the chair across from her, the weight of those words sinking in. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't want a family. You made that very clear. I didn't want to trap you or be a burden. I made the decision to keep him on my own. And when I realized you'd moved on, I let you." He closed his eyes for a moment. "I didn't move on. I built walls. I thought it was the only way to become the man I needed to be." Emily looked down, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "You became someone else, Matthew. You cut off everyone who cared about you, including me. And then you disappeared." He didn't argue. Everything she said was true. She sighed. "I've been sick for a while. It comes and goes, but this time it hit hard. I didn't want Ben to see me like this. But I didn't have anyone else to call." "You should have called me," he said, softer now. "I didn't know if you'd care," she replied, her voice cracking. He leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "I care. I care more than you know. And I want to be here now. For him. For you." Emily didn't answer right away. Her face was unreadable. But then she nodded slowly. "You can stay. For now. But he doesn't know the truth yet. He thinks his dad is someone far away, not someone who left. I didn't want to give him that pain." Matthew swallowed hard. "Then let me earn the right to tell him. I won't walk away again." Ben returned to the room, drying his hands with a towel. "Mom, can we have soup tonight?" Emily smiled, weakly. "If we have the ingredients." Matthew stood. We do. I'll take care of it. As he stepped into the tiny kitchen, he realized how unfamiliar yet grounding this felt. Not business. Not success. Just a kitchen, a family, a second chance, one he never expected, but would do anything to keep. The next morning came with a softness Matthew hadn't felt in years. The house was still and quiet, filled only with the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of old floorboards adjusting to the change in temperature. He had fallen asleep on the worn-out recliner in the corner of the living room, a thin blanket barely covering him, but he hadn't minded. There was something oddly comforting about the faded floral curtains, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the sound of Ben's light footsteps padding into the room just after sunrise. The boy wasn't surprised to see him there. In fact, he smiled sleepily and climbed up beside him without asking. Matthew had never held a child like this before, not even as an uncle, not even as a neighbor helping out. But Ben leaned his head against his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was such a simple gesture, yet it stirred something deep in Matthew's chest. He wanted to freeze this moment and lock it away, a quiet, unspoken promise blooming between them. Emily eventually woke too, and she looked surprised to find Matthew still there. She didn't say anything about it, just offered a quiet, "good morning," and shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee. Matthew followed her, watching how tired she still looked, how her shoulders moved a little more slowly than they used to. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "A little," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Better than yesterday. The medicine helped. I can get more." "Anything you need," he said immediately. "You don't need to worry about costs." Emily gave a small nod, but didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and passed one to him. "Ben doesn't have school today," she said, changing the subject. "It's the weekend. We usually go to the park if I'm feeling well enough." Matthew hesitated, then said, "I'd like to come with you both. If that's okay." Emily paused, mug halfway to her lips, and looked at him properly for the first time since the night before. "I don't know what this is yet," she said softly. "You showing up. It feels like something from another life." "I know," he said. "But I'm not here to make grand gestures. I'm here because I should have been from the beginning." She didn't say anything for a while. Then she nodded. "Okay. You can come." Later that day, the 3 of them walked through the nearby park. It was small and quiet, with a few benches, a worn path, and a swing set that creaked in the breeze. Ben ran ahead, kicking leaves and laughing, the hood of his jacket bouncing behind him. Matthew stayed close to Emily, adjusting his pace to match hers. She still tired easily, and he noticed how she occasionally gripped her side or paused to catch her breath. They sat on a bench and watched Ben climb up the slide and go down over and over again, his joy unfiltered and contagious. "Is he always like this?" Matthew asked with a small smile. Emily smiled too, a little sadly. "He has more energy than I know what to do with. He's a good kid. Kind, thoughtful. He's always been that way. Even when I had nothing, he never complained." "You had him," Matthew said quietly. She turned to look at him again. "You know, he looks so much like you. I kept wondering if that would fade as he grew up. But it didn't." Matthew nodded, swallowing hard. "I see it now. And I hate that I missed all those years." "Then don't miss what's left," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. They sat in silence after that. Not a cold silence, but a quiet one, the kind that comes when people are finally beginning to understand each other again. When they got home that afternoon, Ben drew a picture of the 3 of them at the park. He handed it to Matthew with shy pride. "This is us," he said. "I can draw you again tomorrow if you stay." Matthew looked down at the drawing, crayon figures holding hands beneath a crooked tree, and felt his throat tighten. "I'll be here," he said, ruffling Ben's hair. "Tomorrow, and the day after that too." And for the first time in years, he meant every single word. The days that followed were quiet but full of subtle change. Matthew continued showing up each morning, sometimes bringing groceries, other times with small things for Ben like puzzles or snacks, careful never to overdo it. He didn't want to buy forgiveness or force affection, he just wanted to be there. Emily observed it all, always cautious but no longer cold. She had every reason to keep her walls up, but she never once pushed him away. Instead, she allowed him space to show who he was now, not who he had been when he walked away 7 years ago. One evening, as the sky darkened outside their small living room window and the sound of rain began to tap against the glass, Matthew offered to help prepare dinner. Emily looked skeptical at first. He had always been the type who ordered takeout or hired private chefs, but to her surprise, he moved around the kitchen like someone who had made the effort to learn. He chopped vegetables, boiled water, even asked Ben if he wanted to help stir the soup. It was ordinary. Domestic. But it felt like something sacred. Later, as they all sat at the table eating simple vegetable soup and buttered toast, Emily caught herself watching Matthew more than once. He laughed at Ben's silly stories, listened with real interest, and didn't check his phone once. There was no rush in him. No urgency. Just presence. That was new. After dinner, while Ben was brushing his teeth, Emily stood at the sink, washing dishes as Matthew dried them beside her. For a moment, they were quiet, only the soft clink of plates and the hum of the faucet filling the space. Then Emily spoke, not looking at him. "I never told him about you. I thought about it 1,000 times. But I couldn't bear to let him hope for something that might never happen." "I understand," Matthew said. "I wouldn't have believed me back then either." She nodded slowly. "I was angry for a long time. You left so cleanly. So completely. I thought if I hated you enough, it would hurt less." "And now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not angry anymore," she said, pausing to rinse a dish. "But I'm not sure I trust you either." "Not yet." He didn't flinch. "That's fair. I'm not here to be trusted on words. Just, let me show it. Every day, for as long as it takes." Later that night, Ben pulled out a puzzle and asked them both to help finish it. It was missing a few pieces, but they worked on it anyway, laughing when one didn't fit and celebrating each tiny success. It wasn't much. But it was theirs. At bedtime, Ben hugged Matthew without being asked, his small arms wrapping around his waist. Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable but no longer guarded. That night, Matthew didn't sleep at the house. He left after Ben was tucked in, stepping into the cool evening air. But as he walked away, he didn't feel shut out. He felt, for the first time, like someone who had been invited back to something he thought he had lost forever, not just a home, but a family. And somewhere deep inside, he began to believe that maybe he could be the man they needed, not through perfection, but through staying. Through showing up every single day. Over the following weeks, Matthew found himself adjusting to a rhythm that was completely foreign and yet strangely grounding. Mornings were no longer about boardrooms or private jets. Instead, they were about packing lunch for Ben, making sure Emily had what she needed for the day, and quietly sweeping the kitchen floor before anyone noticed. He didn't try to take over their lives. He simply fit into them, one small act at a time. He started learning what Ben liked, his favorite cereal, the way he liked his bedtime stories read with different voices for every character, the way he got quiet and thoughtful when he was worried about his mom but didn't know how to say it. Matthew didn't push him to talk, but he stayed nearby, letting the silence be safe. Emily remained cautious, but her walls were no longer made of steel. She let him in, piece by piece. Sometimes she'd ask him to pick Ben up from school, other times she'd let him handle the groceries, or even leave him alone in the house while she rested. Trust, he realized, wasn't some dramatic declaration. It was in the small permissions, the everyday allowances that made him feel like he was part of something real. One afternoon, Matthew picked Ben up from school and brought him to a bookstore nearby. It wasn't something extravagant or planned. It just happened. They wandered the aisles, and Ben's eyes lit up as he moved between shelves of adventure books and picture stories. When Matthew offered to buy him two, Ben hesitated. "Can I ask Mom first?" he said, clutching one book tightly. Matthew knelt down and said gently, "You can. But I promised she'd say yes." Ben nodded slowly, then whispered, "Okay." It wasn't just about permission, it was about loyalty. The boy's entire world had been his mother, and Matthew knew he had to respect that. When they got home and Emily saw the books, she smiled. "You picked good ones," she said, ruffling Ben's hair. Then, turning to Matthew, she added, "Thank you, for asking nothing and giving him something." That night, after Ben was asleep, Emily and Matthew sat in the living room with the TV on low. They weren't really watching. Emily was curled up in the corner of the couch with a blanket, sipping tea. She looked better, her skin had more color, and her energy was returning. Still, she was quiet, thoughtful. "He asked me last week if you were going to leave again," she said suddenly. Matthew sat up straighter. "What did you say?" "I told him I didn't know. Because I didn't want to lie to him. But I want to believe you won't." "I won't," he said. "I've walked away from too many things. I'm not walking away from this." She nodded slowly, then looked at him in a way she hadn't in years. Not as someone who had broken her, but as someone she was cautiously learning to see again. "He looks at you like you hung the stars," she said. "That's a powerful kind of hope to carry. Don't drop it." Matthew didn't promise anything more. He just stayed. Helped clean up the dishes. Made sure the front door was locked. Then left quietly, as he always did, giving them space to sleep. On his way home that night, he stopped by the side of the road, pulled over, and sat in silence. He wasn't crying, but something in him was breaking and rebuilding all at once. For years he had built walls of power and money to protect himself from failure, from love, from responsibility. But here he was, stripped of all that, and finally beginning to understand that real strength came not from control, but from showing up and being present even when it terrified him. He looked up at the stars that Ben believed he hung and whispered to himself, "This time, I'll be enough." And for the first time, he believed it might be true. By the time spring began to settle in, bringing with it longer days and the faint scent of blooming flowers on the breeze, Matthew had become a quiet fixture in Emily and Ben's life. It was no longer surprising to find him knocking gently on the door in the mornings or helping Ben tie his shoelaces before school. The neighborhood kids started calling him Ben's dad, without anyone correcting them, and even the clerk at the local grocery store had begun to greet him with casual familiarity. These small signs told Matthew more than any formal conversation could: he was becoming part of their world. Emily still moved carefully around him, not cold anymore, but measured. He understood that. He had no right to rush her forgiveness. Trust wasn't something he could demand, it had to be built, layered one consistent action at a time. He made sure she had everything she needed for her recovery: medication, fresh groceries, and time to rest. But more than that, he gave her space to breathe without feeling watched or owed. He didn't hover. He supported. One Sunday afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the windows and filled the small kitchen with warmth, Matthew cooked breakfast while Emily sat at the table sipping coffee. Ben was on the floor nearby with crayons and paper, humming softly to himself. It felt like a scene from another life, one Matthew never thought he'd get to live. He was flipping pancakes when Emily's voice broke the quiet. "You've changed," she said, not looking up from her mug. Matthew glanced over his shoulder. "Is that a good thing?" "It's a real thing," she replied. "And it's not just about the groceries or helping with Ben. It's the way you look at us now. Like you're actually here." "I am here," he said, setting a plate of pancakes in front of her. "I wish I had been sooner. But I'm here now." I'm not going anywhere. She gave him a look that was somewhere between skepticism and softness. That's still a hard sentence to believe coming from you. I know, he said quietly. That's why I don't say it more often. I just want to live it. Later that day, they went to the nearby community center for a spring event Ben had been excited about all week. There were games, music, balloons, and a bake sale. It wasn't anything grand, but it felt like a celebration of something ordinary, and Matthew loved every second of it. He held Ben's hand as they walked between booths, cheered as he won a small stuffed animal at the ring toss, and laughed when a cupcake exploded frosting all over his suit. Emily watched from a bench under the trees, her arms folded loosely across her chest, eyes following them. When they returned to her side, she looked up at Matthew and said something unexpected. He's never laughed this much in one day. Matthew didn't respond immediately. He sat down beside her and looked across the park, then turned to her with the most vulnerable honesty he had ever allowed himself. Neither have I. That night, after Ben had fallen asleep with his new toy clutched in his arms, Emily stood by the doorway as Matthew prepared to leave. She didn't speak right away. She just leaned against the frame, watching him gather his jacket and keys. You don't have to keep going home every night, she said suddenly. If you ever want to stay, not for good, but, for now. He looked at her, startled but grateful. I'd like that. She nodded. Ben would too. As he settled on the couch with a blanket, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing in the other room, Matthew realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about making up for the past anymore. It was about building a future. And for the first time, that future didn't scare him. It humbled him. He no longer needed skyscrapers or contracts to prove his worth. All he needed was right here, in a quiet house with creaky floors, a little boy who smiled in his sleep, and a woman who might, just maybe, be ready to believe in him again. By the time April gave way to early May, the air had shifted in more ways than one. The house felt different now, not just because of the blooming flowers on the windowsill or the new curtains Matthew had insisted on buying to replace the old sun-faded ones, but because of the unspoken comfort that had begun to settle between the three of them. The awkward pauses were gone. The guarded silences that once hovered in the space between Matthew and Emily had turned into something quieter, gentler, almost warm. They didn't talk about the past often anymore, and they didn't need to. Their conversations were about Ben's drawings, the groceries, the bills, the music playing on the radio. But under the surface of every word was the steady beat of rebuilding. Matthew had started staying over a few nights a week, always on the couch, never asking for more than what Emily was willing to give. But one morning, after a restless night of thunderstorms, he woke to find Ben curled up beside him, still half asleep, a hand clinging to Matthew's shirt. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply lay still, staring at the ceiling in the dim morning light, overwhelmed by how much that one small gesture meant. It wasn't just about love. It was trust. And it wasn't something he could ever take lightly. Emily had gotten stronger, though her illness still cast a shadow. The treatments were working, but slowly. Some days were good, full of energy and brightness, and others left her so exhausted she barely spoke. But she let Matthew carry more on the hard days. She stopped pretending she didn't need help. That, in itself, was a kind of intimacy he hadn't expected. He learned how to read the signs, the way she rubbed her temple when she was dizzy, the way her voice got quieter when she was tired. He never made a show of it. He simply acted. He took care of her, the way he should have long ago, not out of guilt, but because he had grown into the kind of man who didn't run from pain. Especially not hers. One evening, just after dinner, Ben pulled a folded piece of paper from his backpack and handed it to Matthew. "We have family day at school next week," he said, almost shyly. "You're allowed to come, if you want." Matthew took the paper and felt his throat tighten. Emily, sitting across the table, paused mid-sip of her tea and looked over the rim of her mug. Her eyes met his, soft but steady. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She was letting him decide. "I'd love to come," he told Ben, who beamed and immediately launched into a list of activities they'd be doing, games, presentations, even a small performance he'd been practicing in secret. That moment stayed with Matthew for days. He remembered it while driving to meetings. He remembered it while sitting in his penthouse, suddenly too quiet, too big, too cold. He didn't want to split his life anymore. The idea of going back to who he had been, someone detached, controlled, powerful on paper but empty behind closed doors, sickened him. He went to family day. Wore a casual sweater and jeans, sat cross-legged on the classroom floor, clapped the loudest during Ben's skit. Other parents whispered when they recognized him, their kids pointing, some teachers double-taking, but he didn't care. He wasn't there as Matthew Carter, CEO. He was just Ben's dad. On the way home, Ben fell asleep in the back seat. Emily sat in the passenger seat, watching the rain streak the windshield. After a while, she spoke, her voice barely audible over the wipers. "I thought I'd raise him alone forever. I made peace with it." Matthew gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "I'm sorry I made that feel like your only option." She turned to look at him. "You didn't just disappear, Matthew. You erased yourself. And somehow, you still showed up exactly when he needed you." "I wish it hadn't taken that long," he said, glancing at her before turning back to the road. "But I'm here now. And I'll be here every day that follows." Emily looked out the window again. "I believe you," she said quietly. He felt the words land deep in his chest. Not because they were dramatic, but because they weren't. They were simple. Earned. Honest. That night, after Ben had been tucked into bed, Emily brought out an old box from the closet. Inside were photos, ones Matthew had never seen, of Ben as a baby, of Emily holding him in a hospital room alone, of birthdays, scraped knees, and laughter he hadn't been there to hear. She didn't say much while he looked through them. She just sat beside him on the floor, close but not touching, allowing him that space. When he finished, he turned to her and asked quietly, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like, if I'd stayed?" She nodded. "All the time. But I also think about what we're doing now. And I think, maybe, this matters more." He didn't answer. He simply reached out, slowly, and placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. In that quiet moment, with old photographs scattered across the floor and the echo of a child's laughter down the hallway, Matthew realized something he hadn't dared to believe before: forgiveness was possible. And maybe, just maybe, so was love. Summer arrived with gentle heat and long evenings, and by the time June rolled in, the rhythm of their days had become something close to natural. There were still rough moments. Emily had occasional flare-ups, moments when exhaustion took over, but the worst seemed to be behind her. Matthew remained consistent, never missing a day, never needing to be asked. The quiet tension that once followed every interaction between him and Emily had softened into something far more intimate, though still unspoken. It lived in the way she handed him coffee in the morning without asking how he took it anymore, in the way he knew where every dish went in the kitchen, and in how Ben no longer hesitated before calling him Dad. The boy said it casually now, like it had always been true, and Matthew never corrected it. He didn't care that the word had taken time to reach his ears. What mattered was that it had come on its own, without pressure. It was the same way Emily had begun to lean on him, not out of desperation, but from trust built slowly, brick by brick. She let him read Ben bedtime stories even when she wasn't too tired to do it herself. She let him cook, even when he added too much garlic. She let him stay over more often than not, and one night, without ceremony or hesitation, she invited him to sleep beside her, not out of romance, but comfort. He didn't push for more. He simply held her hand and listened to her breathing as she drifted off. Then came the moment he didn't know he had been waiting for. It was a warm Sunday morning, and they were all in the backyard. Emily was seated in a lawn chair under the shade of an old maple tree, watching as Matthew and Ben built a birdhouse together at the small garden table. Ben wore a serious expression, completely focused as he hammered a small nail into the side of the wooden frame, while Matthew held the pieces steady, nodding with approval. The sun made everything feel golden, easy and still. When the birdhouse was done and Ben went inside to grab paintbrushes, Emily stood up and walked over to Matthew. She looked at him for a long time before speaking, and when she did, her voice was calm and certain. "You never asked for forgiveness," she said. He looked up at her. "I didn't think I had the right." "You didn't," she said gently, "but you earned it anyway." He didn't know what to say. For once, there were no rehearsed speeches, no need to explain himself. She had already seen every version of him, the boy who left, the man who returned, the father who stayed. She reached for his hand, and he took it. There was no need to squeeze too hard or hold too long. It was just enough. Later that evening, while Ben was asleep, they sat in the living room surrounded by the quiet hum of cicadas and the soft flicker of candlelight. Emily rested her head on Matthew's shoulder, and for the first time, she said the words he had longed for but never demanded. "I still love you," she whispered. Matthew's eyes burned, but he didn't move. He just let the words settle, like soil around deep roots. He kissed the top of her head and replied without hesitation. "I never stopped." From that moment on, they stopped living in the shadow of what had been and finally stepped into what could be. Matthew sold his penthouse and moved into a smaller home nearby, a house they picked together, where Ben could have his own room and a backyard big enough for a treehouse. He reduced his work hours, turning over much of the daily management to a trusted partner, and focused on what mattered. Not deals or quarterly goals, but morning walks to school, grocery store runs with sticky notes written in Ben's handwriting, and evenings spent making dinner while music played in the background. There were still hard days, of course. Emily's health required monitoring, and Matthew sometimes wrestled with the weight of all the time he had lost. But every night, when they sat on the couch with Ben nestled between them and laughter rising from some silly joke or a shared memory, he felt peace, real, earned peace. The story didn't end in a perfect bow. It didn't need to. It ended in the way real stories do, with the quiet, everyday miracle of people who chose one another again and again. Through hurt. Through healing. Through time. It ended not with a grand finale, but with something better, a life, finally whole. To me, the ending of this story isn't about redemption in the dramatic sense, it's about quiet, persistent healing. It's not about a grand apology fixing everything overnight, but about a man showing up every single day to earn back what he once walked away from. The most powerful part is that forgiveness doesn't come wrapped in a speech, it grows slowly, through shared meals, bedtime stories, and small, ordinary acts of love. That's what makes it believable and moving. Emily's strength is in her quiet resilience, raising a child alone without bitterness, and allowing someone who hurt her back into her life, not out of weakness, but because she sees that he's no longer the man who left. And Matthew's transformation is honest, he doesn't try to erase the past, he just chooses to be better in the present. That's the real happy ending, not perfection, but the courage to begin again, together.